I was 31 when it all went down. I'd been out there a handful of times before, always with friends, always just staying a night or two. But that summer, I was craving something quieter, something longer. I had 2 weeks off, and for once I didn't want airports, phone screens, or even much conversation. I just wanted silence. 5 days out there alone. No signal, no cars passing anywhere nearby, just the woods and me. I'm not some hardcore survival guy or anything. I just know how to pack light but smart. I had my canvas tent, a small stove, a water filter, and a bear canister with just enough food to get through the trip. I didn't bring anything fancy, no GPS, just a physical map and a compass I'd used 100 times before. The trail had plenty of little offshoots to wander down, but it always looped back to the main path eventually, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I set up camp maybe 5 miles in. I found this small flat patch near a bend in the river. Nothing built up, just packed dirt, a bit of grass, trees on 3 sides, and a wide open curve of water in front. The kind of spot that felt hidden away, but still open enough that you wouldn't feel boxed in. I pitched my tent right along the tree line and stacked the rest of my gear where the ground felt firm. Days were warm, nights were cold, exactly the way I like it. The first 2 days were perfect. I spent most of the time sitting by the river, reading, fishing, and just watching the sky drift by. Every now and then I'd hear birds or maybe a rabbit moving through the brush, but nothing bigger. No other campers, no voices. The kind of quiet that sinks deep enough to feel like a full reset. I even started thinking I might stay longer than 5 days. Then on the 3rd morning, I stepped out of my tent and saw it. A small stack of rocks. Just 3 stones, flat and gray, balanced carefully on top of each other, like someone had taken their time with it. Maybe 8 inches tall, sitting about a foot from the edge of my tent. I hadn't seen it the night before. I would have noticed. It was right next to the path I used to walk down to the river. It was strange, sure, but I told myself it had to be an animal messing around. Or maybe some rocks had just fallen into place like that, which honestly felt like a stretch. Still, I didn't want to scare myself over nothing. So I knocked the little stack over with my boot, didn't give it another thought, and went about my day. I fished, cooked, and wrote in my journal, just the usual. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning. Not because of a sound. I just woke up suddenly, like my brain had flipped some switch for no reason. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, trying to figure out what might have woken me. Everything sounded normal. Wind moving through the trees, the tent fabric shifting a little now and then. But something in my gut felt tight. I slowly sat up and looked through the mesh flap of the tent. And there it was again. Another stack of stones. Same height, same exact spot. But this time the bottom stone was darker, almost reddish, and shaped kind of like a wedge. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked around the tent. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no rustling in the brush. Just that stack sitting there, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I picked up the rocks, one by one, and threw them into the river. I stood there watching them disappear into the current. At that point, I wasn't really scared, mostly just annoyed. It felt like some kind of prank, except there was no one else out there with me. The next morning, I decided to move camp. I didn't feel like I was in danger exactly, but the feeling from the night before hadn't really gone away. So I packed up and found another spot maybe half a mile upstream. This one was more open, with less cover, and a better view of both sides of the river. It made me feel like I had a little more breathing room. That night, just after the sun dipped low behind the trees, I noticed someone across the river. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. A tall figure standing completely still between two trees, half hidden in shadow. Too far away to make out clearly, but definitely human-shaped. Not moving, just watching. I called out casually, the way you would to another hiker. "Hey there." No answer. I switched on my flashlight and aimed it across the water. The figure was gone. No sound, no splash, no movement in the brush, just empty space where it had been standing. I stood there holding my breath, scanning the trees for a while. Nothing. I stayed zipped inside my tent the rest of that night, kept the light off, just listened. In the morning, I crossed the river to check the spot where the figure had been standing. The ground over there was soft, perfect for catching footprints, but there were none. No depressions in the dirt, no tracks, not even a broken twig. It looked like no one had ever been there at all. By that afternoon, the clouds had started thickening overhead, and something in my chest began to feel tight. I don't know if it was instinct or just nerves, but I started packing up quickly. I decided I'd hike out that night. If I kept a steady pace, I could probably reach the trailhead by dusk. But I only made it about 3 miles before I stopped. Something felt wrong. My legs were heavier than they should have been, not just tired, slow, uncoordinated, like I had already hiked twice the distance. My breathing felt strange too, shallow, uneven. Then the trail ahead started to look wrong. The trees leaned at strange angles. The slope felt steeper than I remembered. It didn't feel like the same path I had taken in. I froze. After standing there for a while, I turned around and headed back to my original campsite. It felt stupid doing it, but I told myself I'd try again in the morning. Maybe I just needed sleep. But I didn't sleep at all. Sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps. They weren't fast, just soft, careful steps. Slow movement, maybe 5 or 6 feet from the tent. Then silence. Then 3 knocks, clear, even, like someone tapping on the ground. Or maybe tapping against a cooler or some piece of gear. Not branches falling, not an animal scratching. Knocks. I stayed perfectly still, didn't breathe, didn't reach for the flashlight. The fire outside had burned down to nothing, and I wasn't about to light myself up like a target. The steps moved in a slow circle around the tent once. Then nothing. At first light, I slowly unzipped the tent. The stones were back, stacked again, this time taller, 5 rocks now. The top one was smooth and round, almost like it had been shaped by hand. They were balanced right where I had thrown them the first time. And beside the stack, pressed clearly into the dirt next to one of my boot prints, was a single bare footprint. It was longer than mine, wider too. No shoe, no tread, just a flat imprint. Heel, arch, toes. I didn't take time to pack properly. I grabbed whatever I could carry, slung my pack over one shoulder, and started walking. I didn't care how loud I was or how clumsy I moved. I just wanted out. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was early afternoon. My shin was bleeding from a cut I didn't even remember getting. My shoulder ached like someone had hit it with a bat. There was one other car in the parking lot. An older couple was unloading their gear nearby. I didn't even look at them. I just got into my car and drove away. Back in town, I booked a motel room for 2 nights. I laid all my gear out on the bed. I decided to take a solo camping trip near the southern edge of Canlow Ridge. It was early September, right before the temperatures start dropping hard in the mountains. I needed a break from everything. Work had been non-stop, and my head felt constantly full of noise. I hiked in from Croft Pass. With a full pack, it took about half a day, But the trail itself was simple, nothing technical, just steady elevation and long stretches of quiet forest. I brought my canvas tent, 3 days of freeze-dried meals, and my dad's old field journal. He used to hike these mountains alone back in the late 70s. Back then, it wasn't seen as anything unusual. People just grabbed a pack, a map, and went. No GPS, just topographic maps and a compass. His journal was full of small sketches and scattered notes, little landmarks he had drawn, odd-shaped trees, strange rock formations, places he had marked for no obvious reason. I followed one of the routes he had sketched by hand. There was something grounding about walking the same lines he once walked. The place I picked for camp was nearly perfect. A flat stretch of ground near a glacial stream, open enough that I could see movement from a good distance away, but still tucked against a rise in the ridge that helped block the wind. I pitched the tent facing east. Then I filtered a few liters of water and boiled some coffee. It tasted like burnt pennies, but out there, it still felt like a luxury. The first night was completely normal, cold but manageable. I kept my little stove running in the vestibule until I started drifting off. Somewhere in the distance I heard wind, maybe a fox moving across the rocks near the water, but nothing unusual. I've spent enough time camping in the backcountry to know what normal sounds like, and that was exactly what it felt like. Just nature doing what it always does, and me sitting quietly inside it. The second day, I decided to hike a few miles deeper along the ridge. I wanted to find a ravine my dad had drawn several times in the back of the journal. He had marked it with a strange symbol, 3 small slashes and a single dot. I had no idea what it meant. The terrain started getting rough pretty quickly. I dropped elevation fast into a dry gulch. Then I climbed up the other side, grabbing exposed tree roots as handholds. About 3 miles out, I finally found it. A narrow tear in the ground, exactly like the drawing. The sides were steep, probably 15 feet down to the dry creek bed below. Old driftwood branches were tangled across the bottom. They looked like they had been thrown there years ago. The whole place felt untouched, like nobody had been anywhere near it for a long time. I sat down on a rock ledge and pulled out the journal. One of the nearby entries caught my attention. It was short, just a single line. Left the marks again. Can't remember doing it. That was all. No explanation, no context. Just that one sentence sitting there alone on the page. I read it a few times. For some reason, it got under my skin. I couldn't explain why. It just stayed in the back of my mind. That night, I couldn't fully relax. I wasn't scared exactly. It was more like my brain refused to shut off. The air felt different from the night before. Too still. No wind, no insects, no animal sounds. Just a strange pressure in the silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stayed by the fire longer than usual, trying not to think too much about that line in the journal. But sometime around midnight, I noticed something at the very edge of the firelight. Footprints. Boot prints. I stood up so fast I nearly knocked over my camp chair. Those prints weren't mine. They were longer, wider at the toe, and the stride between them was bigger than mine. The impressions were deep enough to hold their shape, but they weren't wet, not fresh enough to have been made just seconds ago. They started about 10 feet from my tent, and they led straight into the trees. I followed them for a short distance, maybe 20 yards. Then they disappeared behind a large, flat boulder. After that, the ground turned rocky. No soil, no place for tracks to form. The trail simply ended, like whoever made them had stepped onto stone and vanished. I walked back to the fire and sat there staring into the dark until the coals started fading. Every time a branch cracked somewhere in the distance, my chest tightened. I didn't crawl back into the tent until the sky had already started turning pale. The next morning, I made a slow circle around the campsite. I checked the ground carefully, looking for more tracks, broken branches, anything that might explain what I'd seen the night before. But everything looked exactly the same. The same footprints, no new ones, no disturbances. Nothing moved, nothing added. And still that silence. I kept telling myself it was probably an old trail. Maybe a trapper had passed through here, maybe a surveyor, someone moving through the ridge a few days earlier. It didn't explain how fresh the prints looked, but I was clinging to anything that sounded reasonable. Later that afternoon, I opened my dad's journal again. I needed something to help make sense of the feeling I couldn't shake. I flipped toward the back pages I hadn't read yet. The handwriting looked different there. Same pen, same style, but something about it felt off. The lines were less steady, more rushed, like whoever wrote them was distracted or tired. One entry caught my attention. It was dated only 2 days after the earlier note. Just one short sentence. Marks moved again. That was it. No details, no explanation, just those 3 words. I sat there for a while staring at the page. Then I noticed something else. In the margin beside the sentence, the same strange symbol. 3 small slashes and a dot, exactly like the one drawn near the ravine. Something about that symbol bothered me more than anything else. I couldn't explain why. It just felt deliberate, like it meant something I wasn't understanding. That night, the air felt even heavier. The silence returned. No wind, no animals, no insects. I sat by the fire again, trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself nothing strange was happening. But sometime after midnight, I heard it. A soft sound, not loud, just a slow shift in the dirt behind me, like someone carefully moving their weight from one foot to the other. I turned quickly. Nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the fire. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, swept the beam across the trees. Still nothing. But when I turned the light down toward the ground, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Fresh marks in the dirt. 3 shallow lines scratched into the soil. And just beside them, a single dot. Exactly the same symbol from the journal. And it hadn't been there before. I knew that for certain. I hadn't slept the rest of that night. I just sat by the fire, watching the trees, waiting for the sun to come up. I didn't pack that night. I didn't move. I just stayed there beside the fire, staring at that symbol scratched into the dirt. 3 lines and a dot, exactly like the ones in my dad's journal, exactly like the ones drawn beside the ravine. The fire slowly burned down to red embers. The cold crept in from the ridge, but I didn't feel it. My eyes kept drifting back to the mark on the ground, trying to figure out how it got there, trying to convince myself I had missed it earlier. But I knew I hadn't. I had walked that exact spot when I set up camp. There had been nothing there. At some point before dawn, I opened the journal again. I started flipping through the pages more carefully this time. Not just reading, studying, looking for anything connected to those marks. Near the very back of the journal, I found another entry. The handwriting was much worse there, uneven, like my dad had been writing in a hurry, or with shaking hands. The line read, "I keep leaving the marks so I know where it's been." I stared at that sentence for a long time, trying to understand what he meant, where what had been. The next line was written smaller, almost squeezed into the margin. "If the marks move again, it means it's still following." That was the last entry in the journal. No explanation, no final note, nothing. Just empty pages after that. By the time the sky started turning pale, I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. Not later, not after breakfast, right then. I packed everything fast, didn't bother cooking, didn't bother cleaning the campsite the way I usually would. Within 20 minutes, I was already moving down the trail toward Croft Pass. I didn't look back, not once. The hike out took a few hours. The trail felt longer than it had the day before, quieter. Every time I stepped on loose gravel or snapped a twig, the sound echoed in a way that made my chest tighten. By early afternoon, I finally reached the trailhead. My truck was still there, exactly where I'd left it. I tossed my pack in the bed and got in the driver's seat. For a minute, I just sat there, hands on the wheel, trying to calm down. Then I pulled the journal out of my bag one last time. I flipped to the final entry again, read it slowly. I keep leaving the marks, so I know where it's been. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the inside of the back cover, there was another symbol, 3 lines, and a dot. But this one had something different, a small arrow drawn beside it, pointing outward, like it meant direction, or movement, or maybe a warning. I closed the journal and threw it back into the bag, started the truck, and drove away from Canlow Ridge without stopping. I never went back there, and I never opened that journal again. But sometimes, when I'm out hiking somewhere else, I catch myself looking down at the dirt without thinking, just checking, just in case, for 3 lines and a dot. Milo and I had gone way out, around 6 miles off the Denali Highway. We had both done cold weather trips before, and we took them seriously. Milo even brought extra fuel tablets he'd been testing back at home. This wasn't our first trip like this, but it was the first time we'd gone this far west, and that detail sticks with me now. The day itself went fine, uneventful in the best possible way. We hiked in, following a rough compass line between 2 small ridge lines, and eventually found a low pocket that looked like a solid place for camp. It had just enough cover to block the wind, but it wasn't so low that moisture would settle in. We built a small fire ring out of flat stones, boiled water, and set out our freeze-dried meals, while the sun dropped behind the peaks, fast and sharp, the way it always does up there. You don't get long sunsets in that place. Dinner was the usual bland stew, and we passed a flask between us while sitting close to the fire, trading stories we'd already told each other at least 10 times. We talked about gear, trail rumors, and some guy Milo knew who swore he saw a moose carcass standing upright last winter. That kind of stuff. Nothing really stood out. It just felt like another quiet night outdoors. Around 10, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into the sleeping bag. Milo stayed out by the fire like he always did. He liked keeping it going even when the heat wasn't really needed. Said the light helped him think. Our tents were maybe 15 feet apart, both facing north, with just enough distance between them to give each other space. I woke up sometime later. It was still completely dark, and the only sound was the wind. I didn't have a watch, but something felt wrong. You know that strange awareness when your eyes are closed, yet you can somehow sense light nearby? That's what woke me. I blinked, slowly sat up, and unzipped the tent flap just a couple inches. The fire had burned down to soft red embers, barely alive, but there was a glow off to the left, higher up near the ridgeline. It wasn't the moon. The color was dull orange, kind of like a dying lantern, or one of those old headlamps running on a weak battery. It wasn't moving. It just hung there, completely still, almost like it was floating in place. My first thought was that Milo had wandered up there for some reason, maybe to take a leak. Maybe he'd heard something. Maybe he just needed to clear his head. Wouldn't have been that strange. I zipped the tent closed again and laid back down. But I didn't sleep. I watched that faint glow through the tent fabric for at least 15 minutes. It didn't move, didn't flicker, didn't pulse. It just stayed there, steady. No footsteps, no voice calling out. Eventually, the tension got to me. I pulled my boots on inside the tent, something I almost never do. Then I unzipped the flap all the way and stepped outside with my flashlight. The air hit me hard. It was colder than before. I glanced at Milo's tent first. Still zipped. No light. No movement. I stood there for a moment, staring up toward the ridge. The glow was still there, but it was lower now. Not like it had walked down, just closer to the ground somehow, maybe half as high as before. I couldn't see a body or a figure, just the light itself. I crouched beside Milo's tent and tapped on the side. No answer. I unzipped the corner and leaned inside. He was completely out. Earplugs in, sleeping bag zipped all the way up to his chin, totally unaware. I backed out, stood up, and looked toward the ridge again. The glow was gone. Just like that. I swept my flashlight across the trees. The beam bounced off branches but didn't catch anything reflective. No shine, no shadow, just the quiet whisper of branches overhead and dry pine needles shifting in the wind. Back in my tent, I didn't even try to sleep. I just lay there fully dressed, flashlight in one hand, boots still on. Every creak of fabric made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was probably a reflection from the fire. Maybe a strange angle, something ordinary. By the time the sun came up, I'd almost convinced myself of that. Milo unzipped his tent around 7. He looked like he had just slept through a comfortable night in a hotel. He started boiling water with that calm, focused morning routine he always had, like nothing unusual had happened. I waited until I was halfway through my second mug of coffee before finally asking, "Did you go up the ridge last night?" He frowned slightly, like he was trying to remember something. Then he shook his head. "No, I crashed around midnight, didn't wake up once." We didn't talk about it again after that. Not directly. Around noon, we packed up and moved west toward our second campsite. It was maybe 2 miles farther, near a flat, frozen creek. The clearing was wide and open. There were fewer trees and less cover. Probably not as comfortable, but Milo said it would make for great stargazing. We didn't talk much while we were setting up camp. It wasn't exactly tension, but something felt different. That kind of quiet, where both people are deliberately avoiding a certain subject. That restless silence, where even small talk feels heavy. That night, Milo went to bed first. I stayed by the fire. I kept looking over the map and watching the flames slowly burn down. Just before midnight, I switched off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The stars were incredibly bright. There was no wind, just still air. It felt like everything around us had pressed pause. Then I heard a sound. Crunch. Snow. A deep, slow compression. Like someone stepping onto a fresh patch. It came from maybe 30 feet away, past a line of thick brush. I froze. There wasn't a second step, no movement, just that single sound. I turned my headlamp back on and slowly stood up. Then I swept the beam toward the direction where the noise had come from. Nothing. No shape, no movement, just snow, dark branches, and tangled brush. "Hey," I called out. Firm, loud enough to carry, but not shouting. "You all right?" No answer. I stood there for a few more minutes. The fire popped once behind me. Still nothing from the trees. I took a few careful steps toward the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw it. Just outside the reach of the firelight, half buried in untouched snow. A footprint, not a bear track, a human foot. The toes were long and slightly spread apart. The heel angled inward, like whoever stepped there had pivoted slightly. There was no sock, no shoe, and no other tracks around it. No footsteps leading in, no trail leading away. Just that single, clear imprint. My heart started pounding. My breathing felt tight in my chest. I slowly stepped back. Then I walked backward toward Milo's tent. I turned and shook him awake. He sat up, groggy, holding a knife instead of a flashlight. I pointed toward the clearing. "There's something you need to see." We walked back together. He crouched down beside the footprint. He didn't touch it. He just stared at it. Then he stood and slowly scanned the tree line. After a long silence, he said one sentence. "Let's break it down now." That was it. No debate, no hesitation. We packed everything in about 10 minutes. Didn't even heat water. We rolled everything tight, threw on our packs, and started hiking east. We skipped the rest of the trip completely, and neither of us ever went back there again.